All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Carrie Tirado-Brayman, the director of the Gender Institute here at UB. And thank you for joining us for our final Feminist Research Alliance talk of this semester. And before I introduce our speaker, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Buffalo operates is the territory of the Seneca Nation, a member of the Haudenosaunee Six Nations Confederacy. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty of Peace and Friendship, a pledge to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. It is also covered by the 1794 Treaty of Canandaigua between the US government and the Six Nations Confederacy, which further affirmed Haudenosaunee land rights and sovereignty in the state of New York. Today, this region is still the home to the Haudenosaunee people, and we are grateful for the opportunity to live, work, and share ideas in this territory. I am delighted to introduce to you today Dr. Laina Bay-Cheng, who is Professor and Associate Dean for Faculty Development at UB School of Social Work. For the entirety of her career, Bay-Cheng has concentrated her research on the imprint of social forces and material conditions on young women's sexual lives. She continues to make the case that girls' sexual vulnerability is neither the fault of girls nor an inevitable function of sex, but instead is a result of social injustice. Bay-Cheng is currently pursuing two lines of research. First, she continues to interrogate how neoliberal ideology pervades sexual discourse, including its trumpeting of agency, choice, and consent, often to the detriment of young women. And second, she is using Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach to study the gap between the sexual rights and resources that marginalized young women have on paper and those that are actually accessible on the ground. She is a highly published scholar who received a Gender Institute Faculty Research Award last year. She serves on the editorial board of Ophelia, Journal of Women in Social Work. For many years, she was a consulting editor for Psychology of Women Quarterly, and she co-chairs the gender cluster of the Society for Social Work Research. She founded a cross-campus mentoring program at UB to support minoritized PhD students, and she is an active member of the Hope Buffalo Community Coalition to foster youth sexual rights and well-being. And finally, she credits her feminist upbringing. This is my favorite part, from her mother, her sisters, her undergraduate education at Wellesley College, and her doctoral training with Abby Stewart at University of Michigan's Institute for Research on Women and Gender, for enabling her research and her career. And it's my genuine pleasure to welcome Professor Laina Bay-Cheng to our virtual Gender Institute. So welcome, Laina.
Thank you all so much. It's so funny, such a formal introduction, for which I totally appreciate. Thank you, Carrie, but, and it's so generous, but also it's kind of funny and really wonderful because I'm seeing people sort of that I haven't seen in a long time, and people who, who have been, I don't know, I sort of think of as having been colleagues now as I've developed a lot of this work. And so I appreciate being able to share it, even if in a more formal way. Okay, I'm going to do that awkward moment where I transition to screen sharing. And hopefully now everything is fine. I mentioned, and probably everybody who's been sort of habituated to life on Zoom knows that it's really hard to monitor the chat while I'm talking and trying to manage like slides and things like that. So just like put questions in chat. There we go. Hillary just put it in. And we'll talk after everything. Okay. So, all right. So my career, as Carrie said, has pretty much been focused completely for its entirety on girls' sexuality, and really two central questions regarding sexual agency. So first, how it's prescribed by social and material conditions, and second, how it still is nevertheless exercised amid social and material inequalities. It's interesting to me that over the course of my career, which is now like 20 years, I've gone from, being asked like, what is sexual agency? Because people only heard the word agency in relation to like travel agency, which doesn't even exist anymore, like a travel agent. But now, of course, people see the word being taken up and used in popular discourse in a bunch of ways. So it's part of the power behind Cardi B's creative talent and commercial success. It's being brought on screen. It's being reclaimed. Women with sexual agency, AKA ladies who are sexual connoisseurs, are threatening the status quo, flipping gender scripts, and unraveling patriarchal values, right? So those are good things, but they're not unequivocally, uncritically good. And this was a little bit my argument in a previous paper from 2015, in which I argued and sort of floated the idea that the conventional virgin slut continuum, dividing the virtuously abstinent, so Miley Cyrus, circa 2014, from the licentiously active, so Miley, circa 2015. And I use her images a lot because she was the one who was sort of cited in a lot of this work at the time that I was writing this paper about the agency line. Anyway, so that this continuum had been reshaped by neoliberal ideology and also its co-option of feminism into a matrix, so that women are no longer judged and categorized only based on their presumed sexual activity, but also now their supposed and performed agency. I argued that girls now have to toe what I call the agency line through their enactment of a neoliberal brand of agency, playing the part, just as they might play the part of a guileless innocent, that girls are now expected to play the part of an agent with a capital A. And that as an agent, you can be abstinent or active, but you better be, or at least seem convincingly, in control of yourself and under the control of no one else, including social forces. In a follow-up study, I asked participants, it was like about 180 adults, and I'm not going to be getting into a lot of stuff today, but I'm happy to do that if people are interested. So I asked participants, about 180 adults in the United States, men and women, to imagine young women who are in control of their sexual lives, whether channeling that agency into activity or abstinence. And we asked, so what would these young women look like? Like, go online and grab some pictures and share them with us. And these are the images, or at least a few of them. There are like literally, I think 1,000 or something. Hannah Ginn, who's a PhD student working on analyzing the visual data with me, she could probably tell you in detail how many images there are. Anyway, so these are some of the images they shared of what they kind of conjured up a woman with agency, a young woman with agency would look like. We also asked about their personalities, and these were some of the attributes that were common to both abstinent and active agents. That a woman with sexual agency is ambitious, independent, popular, strong, capable. We asked what a woman with agency would act like in their sexual interactions in open-ended questions. And participants said, she doesn't get used. Sex is on her terms. She enjoys sex and relationships and sets firm boundaries. She won't be walked all over. She doesn't take crap from anyone. She doesn't allow others to get the best of her. This is just a sort of short, tiny little snippet, but they do capture a sort of predominant theme. So across these images and ratings and descriptions, participants depicted young women with sexual agency as strident, brimming with drive and verve and confidence. In many ways, the model good resistance subjects of feminism, as Harris and Dobson might say. The ways in which this operates normatively and as yet another form of pressure, one that is fueled by, but also fuels the degradation of victims and victimization, while also concealing and protecting those who commit violence and victimization, is a whole other strain of my research program. But the concern I want to focus on today has to do not just with how women push and perform in order to have a shot at being cast in the role of agent, but how this discourse of agency and this lens through which we look at girls and young women trains us to see and recognize agency only when it takes particular forms and only when it's performed by particular girls. And so I'm uneasy that even as sexual agency is talked about more quantitatively, what we mean by it qualitatively, who we mean by it, and how it leads us to act is static, if not shrinking. So I am not going to argue that sexual agency is not maybe the ability to act in a way that accomplishes your goals or to produce the results you want. But I do think that this is agency in its simplest and its most privileged form, right? The ability to act in a way that accomplishes which goals. And what if you're acting in a way to produce some results that you want, but that means that you're also getting some results that you don't want? So for instance, Brianna was a 16-year-old girl I worked with during my very brief stint as a clinician. And she used to agree to have sex with her middle-aged manager from her job at Target if he let her stay at his house on nights when she didn't feel like she could be safe at her own home because of her parents' substance use and the often ensuing violence, either between them or directed at her. So sex with him was not a result she wanted, but safety and not having to deal with what she called drama at home, those certainly were. And then there's Jeanette, who was a participant in a study I conducted with Annie Bruns and funded by the Gender Institute about unwanted sex. And Jeanette was a young woman who had aged out of foster care, and she was a sophomore in college when we interviewed her. She talked a lot about her first boyfriend, Chris, who was just like a nasty high school boyfriend. She stayed with him throughout high school and through the first few months of her first year as an undergrad. And here's how she described using that relationship to help her transition to life at college. The whole idea of stability wasn't something that I was really familiar with. At the same time, being in a new environment, it was the whole idea of an unstable ground, trying to find stability. And at that point, this guy I was with, he was kind of that stable thing for me at that point. And then last, I think of Stephanie, who was 16, and she was living in a group home at the time that she was a participant in a study with me and Dr. Nicole Fava. So Stephanie had a boyfriend, Lawrence, whom she saw on weekends, and he was 20, he had an apartment, he had a car, he had a job that was stable. And when we asked her what she imagined her life would be after she aged out of foster care, she was explicit that Lawrence, living with Lawrence, that was her post-discharge plan. She also regularly consented to sex with him that she did not want, did not enjoy, was often unprotected, and that stressed her out. But as she reasoned, I don't want to lose him over something stupid. It isn't the worst thing in life. And I do it when he's absolutely needing it, so he doesn't go into a breakup mode, or so it doesn't turn into a really bad argument, because I can't afford to lose him. For Brianna, Jeanette, and Stephanie, acting in a way that accomplished their goals and producing the results they wanted, avoiding violence from parents or partners, transitioning to college, being able to see what the next step in life might be, that meant consenting to sex, partners, and relationships that were exploitative, unsafe, and unenjoyable. But if we only see agency in its simplest forms, we might miss or mistake the agency that Brianna, Jeanette, and Stephanie exercise through their strategic consent and their compelled risk-taking. We might think, for instance, that they need a lesson in sexual risk and how dangerous it could be, or a sexual assertiveness skill boosting program, like the one that was offered to, and still is, I think, to girls in Maryland's juvenile justice and child welfare systems. So they go through a curriculum with lessons entitled "Creating the Future You Want!" and "How to Make Your Choices Stick!" again, exclamation point. As though for girls who more likely than not have histories of serial exploitation and deprivation at all system levels, willpower is somehow what they need or what they lack. I referred to Brianna, Johnette, and Stephanie in a review I wrote last year for the Journal of Sex Research, and in it I advocated accepting sexual agency as a given, as a matter of fact, basically suggesting that it's not that interesting, that everyone is demonstrating agency all the time, that living is evidence of agency, and that instead of seeing Brianna, Johnette, and Stephanie, and girls like them, as target populations for agency boosting sessions, we might instead recognize them as suffering actors who are compelled and constrained by external forces, hardship, and deprivation, yet who are no less invested in the thick desires of material security, intellectual stimulation, emotional and physical intimacy, and hope for the future. But pursue these through everyday agency, the means and avenues that they can see, access, and afford. In their cases, that meant sexual relationships with men. Their strategic consent was not enthusiastic. They did not resemble the agents conjured up in popular discourse or by the participants in the study that I cited earlier. Brianna, Johnette, and Stephanie are not good resistance subjects of feminism. Beyond acts of resistance or dramatic efforts to survive, sexual agency manifests in everyday efforts to move along, to make it to the next day, to make your situation a little bit better, or even just tolerable, either in the moment or in the longer term. This same undercurrent, right, it runs through the why I stayed and why I didn't report tweets from women who talk about how without reliable resources and viable options, they often exercise agency through apparent inaction, not reporting, not leaving, not refusing. Agency, so while agency is a fundamental feature of all humans and human behavior, how it's exercised bears the indelible imprint of where and when it's exercised. Whether it's thickened by resources of all sorts that expand how much latitude and influence one has over their lives, right? So do you live in an environment in which you have space and freedom and access to explore, sort of like parkland? And is that space generally safe enough that in your exploration, mistakes and missteps, they might hurt, but they're unlikely to be catastrophic? Or is your agency thinned by structural, predetermined disadvantage, maybe also by some bad luck? Not lessened in amount necessarily, but constrained, right? So shut off and shut in and channeled, allowing only maneuvers or minor adjustments within narrow confines, many of which just lead into dead-end rooms. But many girls' agency is thinned to the point of consisting of little more than just trying to move forward, in spite of not knowing or having any evidence or reason to believe that it's going to lead somewhere that much better. When Stephanie said, "I can't afford to lose him," and that's actually a phrase that she repeated a couple of times in the interview, she said she couldn't afford to lose Lawrence. And so she consented strategically to unwanted and unprotected sex. And she was very matter of fact about this. This was not like, you know, she wasn't in tears. This wasn't great trauma. She said it wasn't the worst thing in life, right? So when she consented strategically, she wasn't wrong. She was a minor. She was Black. She's low income. She's in the child welfare system, and she was going to age out of it. She was wholly disidentified from school. That was also something she talked about. She had no family or community that she could count on. Lawrence was her conduit to resources, and she could keep him and that access by going along with sex when and how he wanted. And it was the only channel open for her agency. So her relationship with Lawrence was worrisome, was troubling, including to her, right? She was not too thrilled with this. But her situation also begs the question of what options did she have? What could she do? And at the heart of Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach is this similar question. What is someone actually able to do and to be? Nussbaum and economist Amartya Sen, they offered this question as a sort of diagnostic for assessing the quality of life and social justice in a social system. Nussbaum in particular argued that in order for a life to be of a quality that is worthy of human dignity and for a system to claim that it's socially just, all constituents, without exception or condition, must experience 10 basic capabilities. Life, so as a matter of sort of avoiding preventable or early death. Bodily health, under which Nussbaum included basic material needs, so shelter, food, and reproductive health. Bodily integrity pertains to mobility and security and autonomy, including in one's sexual and reproductive life. Senses, imagination, and thought involves getting to experience diverse forms of stimulation and expression and pleasure through learning and creativity. Emotions, which included the full range of possible positive and negative feelings that are associated with like relationships and life. Practical reason centers on the ability and the right of somebody to direct their own lives according to the values and priorities and goals that they set for themselves. Affiliation is the right to have relationships with others and to form attachments, and also to be treated with dignity. Other species pertains to engaging with the physical world around us. Play, obvious, and then control over environment, which she broke out into both material control, so access to resources, independent direct access and stable access to resources, and also engagement, political engagement and participation and voice. So these capabilities, she argued, are the minimum required to have a life that is worthy of human dignity. And that dignity, rights, worth, these are things that are universal, that they are unconditional. They're not contingent or predicated on particular contributions or competencies, that we have dignity and worth as we are, however we are, including imperfect as we are. And this, I think, is especially important when it comes to young people, because so often we are always telling young people that their value today is contingent on what they might one day become, that they are not yet fully human, that they do not yet have these rights. And the capabilities approach would reject that, and to say that no, we deserve to experience capabilities today. Importantly, what's also universal is our vulnerability and our imperfection and our need for help. So the capabilities approach doesn't pretend that, you know, we have within us the ability to experience and exercise all of these capabilities, but that we are imperfect and therefore all need help in different ways, to more or less, sort of greater or less amounts. Anyway, that we all need help in one way or another, and that our capabilities emerge from the combination of our internal resources, so yes, whatever we're born with, and external support, so help. Nussbaum's position was that supplying this help is the purpose of governments. It is the purpose of our social systems. One of the most potent refrains in Nussbaum's work, and that I sort of hook onto a lot, is that it's not enough to pay lip service to liberty, to offer what she calls rights on paper. She says, liberty is not just a matter of having rights on paper, it requires being in a material position to exercise those rights. And this requires resources. And it's this issue, this sort of rights on paper, and how the rights that are granted to girls on paper often mask the thinning of their agency on the ground. That's kind of at the core of the research project that is funded, thank you, by the Gender Institute, called You Be Capable Girls. And I'm working on this with a team of extraordinary PhD student colleagues at the School of Social Work. So there are a few different stages to Capable Girls project. In a non-COVID world, we'd be done with everything and telling you about all of the brilliant things that we discovered. As it so happens, we are still proceeding, but it's a little bit different than we planned. But we do have results from our first stage of data collection, in which we talked to diverse social service and healthcare providers in Buffalo to learn from them what they understood and see as the rights and resources that exist for girls in Buffalo, at least on paper. And then in the current stage of data collection, we're learning from girls what these rights and resources look like from their perspective on the ground. Okay, so but the service providers in this first stage, they did have a lot of insight into the ways in which girls in Buffalo were not in a position to exercise their rights on paper. And so just to explore one example, and I don't know how many people know this, but in New York State, youth of any age are entitled to full reproductive sexual health care without parental consent or notification. So complete and completely confidential sexual and reproductive health care. This is, I think of it as like a crucial right. And it would appear, based on this right that exists on paper, that girls in New York State have sexual agency of the kind of thick, wide open, wandering through a parkland variety, at least insofar as getting the sexual and reproductive health care that they want, not just what they need, but what they want. But in fact, what we've learned through interviews with service providers and then qualitative policy analysis was how young women's agency, in this specific instance, their right to complete and confidential care, is thinned to the point of being practically inoperable, including by other policies. So we identified 3 types of policy-based barriers that kind of attenuated girls' rights to care. So some policies are designed to control and monitor what youth know, to channel information and access. So sex education policies and programs, for instance, they serve a regulatory purpose to dictate who knows what, when, and from whom, what educators can talk about and how. This is something that the sex educators who we interviewed talked about. They talked about the frustrations that they feel being bound by a scripted curriculum and yet being really being in this work because they want and believe and care deeply about responding to girls' questions and issues as they're presented, not just as they're written in a manualized curriculum. Beyond what happens in a sex education classroom, parental opt-out policies grant parents and guardians the right and the power to determine who gets to sit in those sex ed classes in the first place. So youth may have sexual rights in New York State, but whether they know about them is left up to others to decide. And needless to say, it is impossible to exercise a right that you don't know or believe exists. We also identified policies that mean well, right, or have intentions that we don't necessarily disagree with, but that accidentally threaten girls' sexual and reproductive health rights. So age of consent and mandatory reporting laws, for instance, create a lot of confusion among girls and providers and parents about what will be kept confidential, under what conditions, from whom, and how. One provider that we talked to who specializes in training providers about these laws talked about how they are so sticky and that they create lines that are very blurry for providers who also are often undertrained, not through any fault of their own, but because of the defunding and the underfunding of our social welfare systems and agencies. There's also reporting involved in insurance billing, which I had no idea about, but we learned a lot about. When you go see the doctor, you get an explanation of benefits form, right? That says, you know, what treatment was provided. Now that transparency might seem great, right? A sort of like Bill of Rights kind of thing, but it actually poses an explicit threat to the confidentiality promised to youth by New York state law. Last are policies that impede youth sexual rights by default. And this basically captures those policies that fail to take youth and or sexuality, particularly at the margins, into account in the first place. So ironically, but not a surprise to anybody who thinks about sort of public systems and environments, transportation was cited almost unanimously among the providers we interviewed as a barrier to minors' sexual rights. Not because transportation doesn't exist, but because it's inaccessible, it's too expensive, or because it's treated as a privilege. So Buffalo Public School System has an arrangement with the public transit system. They have a contract that offers students free bus passes, which is great if you're a student. but it's written so that students in good standing have greater latitude and flexibility in how they can use their bus passes. But that those who are in not as good academic standing, their rights to use their bus passes are whittled away and become stricter and stricter, treating mobility and access as conditional rewards rather than universal rights, and leading basically to an arrangement in which those who meet this benefit and this policy is of least use to those who need it most. So if we want the rights promised to New York's youth to be more than mere words on paper, we have to heed Nussbaum's charge that to secure capability to a person, it's not sufficient to produce good internal states of readiness to act. It is also necessary to prepare the material and institutional environment so that people are actually able to function. I see this as an important and very necessary rebuttal to policies and programs that concentrate change efforts on girls, imploring them to make their choices stick, offering them lessons in assertiveness, and reminding them of the importance of personal responsibility. Brianna, Jonette, Stephanie, right, they don't lack agency. What they lacked were options and channels for exercising agency. And this was not their failure. This was the failure of systems charged with their care, from their families up through their communities. A failure to provide the resources necessary for them to experience basic capabilities. Girls don't need more agency. They need environments that expand and widen what's possible. They need direct access, unmediated by parents or partners, to adequate, stable, and diverse resources. So what this might mean and what could this look like? So ethically and equity-driven policies and systems that use youth rights, not parental prerogatives, preferences, or privileges as the starting point and the parameters for offering healthcare, social services, education. I want to return to the capabilities approach's core question. What is someone actually able to do and to be? Because the phrasing is simple, but it is significant. It asks, what is a person actually able? Not ideally, not supposedly. And what are they able? Not should not, but what are they able to do and to be? It does not ask, as so many people do when they talk about or research girls, what should they be doing? Or like, oh my God, what are they doing, right? There's a lot of that about girls' sexuality. The capabilities approach's sole investment is in expanding what one can do. It does not prescribe what one ought to do. And this is no small matter, especially when it comes to young women and to sexuality. And I see it as a very radical challenge to neoliberal injunctions about right choices, personal responsibility, and that it's predicated instead on universal liberty and dignity and on a system's obligations to all its constituents. It's also, I think, a radical departure from even seemingly well-intentioned programs, right, that just aim to eliminate infection, to eliminate unwanted pregnancy, to eliminate coercion and assault. Programs that set their sights on important things, but negative rights, simply the absence of violation or the minimization of adversity, right? Those do not scratch the surface of what it means to experience capability. We could eliminate any of those things, for instance, just by restricting girls' movement entirely, restricting their right to relationships, their rights to self-expression, their opportunities, right, to engage with others. This is, I would argue, what many of our policies and programs and our approaches to girls and their sexual lives try to do. They try to channel, to regulate, and to direct girls, not expand what's possible, but to steer them in the direction that we think they ought to be going in. Arguably, this is also what like the pseudo-feminist discourse of agency and how it equates agency with only strident self-interest, right? That's what it's also doing, right? It's narrowing and it's disciplinary. A capabilities approach would absolutely say that ending infection unintended and unwanted pregnancy and violations are important and worthwhile ends, but that the means to achieving those ends cannot come at the expense of liberty and dignity, including the dignity of risk. And I want to credit Hannigan, who is a PhD student that I work with, for really helping me think through ideas about risk in a new way. So in so many other domains of life and development, we totally understand that risk is not the enemy, that it's not a thing to be avoided. In fact, we push children into risk taking, right? We have whole, I don't even know how many inspirational quotes we have that people hang on their walls in offices, right? About nothing ventured, nothing gained, and finding your learning edge, right? We are the entrepreneurial society, all of these things, right? It's all risk and embracing the risk. We understand that taking chances, including when things go wrong or when they're scary, is when we learn best and most. We get that risk fuels growth, that it's a developmental right. This, I would argue, is no less true of sex. Sex, relationships, figuring out how to treat someone, figuring out how you want to be treated, and being able to communicate all of those things. Those are things that we learn, often by doing it a little bit wrong, right? This is normal, it's necessary, it's how we learn in all domains of life. And youth sexuality researchers from a host of home disciplines and working with a range of qualitative and quantitative methods have found that indeed, like most life skills, practice makes, if not perfect, it makes better, right? So young people who experiment and experience things in their sexual lives, they become better communicators. Girls who with sexual experience become more confident. They have better sexual lives, by which I don't just mean sort of measures of sexual health, but qualitatively. They feel better about themselves, about their choices, about their partners, about how they get treated, and what they expect and want from future relationships. They have a richer sense of sexual well-being. One of the fundamental ways in which I think that young women's sexual agency is thinned by injustice is that the social material conditions of their lives leave no room or cushion for error. That this ultimately sort of thwarts their opportunities to take the sorts of risks that build to mastery, or we leave them inequitably vulnerable to avoidable consequences. Right, so to stretch the child rearing analogy a little bit further, when we have a toddler, right, how do we prepare our environment so that they are actually able to function? We don't restrict them and their movements, right? We don't put them in playpens, all day long, because we don't want to have to baby proof. No, we put locks on our toilets. We put the poisons in a cupboard where children can't reach them. We put gates on our stairs, right? We do all kinds of things to baby-proof, to prepare the environment so that the babies and the children can experience the world and can take the risks that will make them stronger. This is what I imagine when I think about what a capabilities approach to youth sexuality might entail, right? Preparing the environment by crafting policies and programs that offer universal access to equally clean environments, access to care that adults, privileged adults, enjoy all the time, sexual reproductive health care services, but also caring relationships with loved ones, with peers, opportunities to think through what their own priorities are, to cultivate and enjoy practical reason, and then live their lives accordingly, right? So mistakes are gonna happen, for sure. But more often than not, catastrophe can be avoided. And in fact, most adults with privilege, this is true of us, right? We are often able to avoid catastrophe. It's our responsibility to make sure that this is not just something that those with privilege get to experience. And so that this is what social justice is, according to Nussbaum, that all people are equally capable of living their lives as they wish. Injustice, on the other hand, it is the narrowing of life for some, the narrowing of liberty and of what is possible, the thinning of agency. One of the primary risks of the gravitational pull of the prescriptive and individualized view of agency is, I think, that we look too much at girls. And I say this a lot, but I think we look at them, whether we look at them as problems or we look to them for solutions, which I think a lot of feminist discourse and programs do. But that either way, we are looking too much at girls, and that this is a way of abiding by and reinscribing neoliberal rules, right, that train our focus on individuals, and also misogynist ones that direct our gaze toward girls and women's bodies, but meanwhile leave the conditions of their lives unchanged. So girls' bodies are not public property, but I would argue that ensuring their capabilities and thickening their agency, sexual and otherwise, is our collective responsibility. Thank you.
That was a fantastic talk, Laina. It was absolutely powerful. And I love your turn of phrase, the narrowing of liberty, the dignity of risk. My question for you is, how receptive are policymakers for this institutional change? Because I appreciate so much how you're trying to move from the psychologically focused critique of choice, of individual agency, and move toward the structural. Right. It reminds me of Kate Mann's book, where we have to get from finger pointing at individual misogynists to looking at misogyny as a system of power and a structure of power. And so I was starting to think about, the larger structures of power. Look at New York State. I love how you look at different scales of that institution, from the local to the state to the national. And how receptive are they? Because, there is, and well, the educational theory that says the point of school is precisely to alienate, right? That is the function of it. And so how would you respond to that critique, and how receptive are the policymakers to thinking more broadly about structural change?
So I think that there are a few different barriers that get thrown up. And I think one of them is that often, and this is the thing that I've been trying to do more and more when I'm working with community partners. And I think, it's not like I'm teaching anybody anything, right? Community coalitions are already trying to do this, which is to talk about sexual rights, not in terms of sex. This, for a bunch of reasons in the United States, we have so many problems because we think that some sort of different rules apply to sex, right? We lose our minds when it comes to sex. It's like gravity is different in that world. It becomes very difficult for people to reason. But I think if we talk instead, not about sexual rights, but we talk about this as a matter of racial justice, right? So this is increasingly, I think, an important way to frame these issues. Sexual risk is not about sex. If we look at Buffalo alone, 7 zip codes in our city account for over half of the chlamydia and gonorrhea rates in the entire county. Those 7 zip codes are predominantly Black. What this means is that, right, and I often say, sex isn't that interesting. It's not like girls in 14215 are doing something wildly different than 14222. What's different is that some have racial privilege and some do not. And some people are deprived of basic care. And so, so I really think we should lean into the racial justice and the economic justice issue, which is that, and this is where I think sort of recovering and reframing how we think about risk is really important, which is that the shutting in that poverty and racism and misogyny and the way that those things go together, what that results in is it stunts what people can be. And who doesn't want a young person going into life feeling like they really could be anything, right? And feeling like they can seize that opportunity. And so I think that getting people to think not just about sex, but to understand that sexual injustice is and the sort of disparities are a function of racial injustice and of misogyny is a way to get people on board and to build coalition and to make it really clear that we're not trying actually to tell any young person what they should do, but we do think that all young people should have the opportunity to decide for themselves what they want their lives to be. And this is not a new idea. This is actually sex education in the United States in the 1970s really embraced this values clarification stance. And it argued that this is what sex education classrooms should be, is they should be sort of sites of values clarification. And that young people should have all of the information and be able to have opportunities to decide what matched their values. And that might match their parents and it might match their churches, and that is totally fine. And that is completely acceptable. It's, we're not like trying to traffic in like sexual liberation and prescribed ideas of that either. But I just would say the other and most immovable barrier that I see actually is adultism, and getting adults to understand that, if there are social science people, you maybe are familiar, or maybe just not even social scientists, but sexism is talked about as benevolent sexism or hostile sexism, right? There's the like, women need to be taken care of and protected version of sexism. And so much of adultism takes that form, right? We're like, oh, we need to cherish and take care of these young lives and protect them from what they don't understand and protect them and, like keep them safe, but in ways that ultimately just sort of justify adult power over young people's bodies and minds. And I think that is a difficult thing to move. And that I think we have not even begun to chip away at, because people really think of parents and parents' rights. There is constant deference to what a parent thinks a young person should do. I think that is the real challenge, to be honest.
Yeah, thank you, Laina, for that fantastic answer. Well, let's open up the floor. I see Corinne, you have your hand up, and then Maria Amir put a question into the chat box. So Corinne, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Okay. So thank you so much. I'm sitting here having this schizophrenic relationship to this talk, because on the one hand, it was so lucid and so amazing and such a pleasure to listen to. And on the other hand, my brain is exploding with the information that you just gave, because of course I have a 16-year-old daughter and I'm like, oh my God, and she's part of the privileged zip code, but still, right? There are things that I recognize, the research you did with the responses to what is sexual agency, how much negative phrasing there is. And that broke my heart, right? Like that broke my heart, because I feel like every time I listen to a talk like this, I feel like I'm back in graduate school having the same discussions, right? And so my question to you is, first of all, I appreciate, if I were to sum it up, is it fair to say sexual agency is not about sex, is your talk, right? And I thought of Foucault, right? Immediately when he was talking about we should produce laws about rape that remove rape from, right? Like the sexual, let's talk about rape as a punch in the face, right? Like that kind of, I was there with you and thinking through it. Of course, my dog is gonna have something to say about that, but thinking about the whole talk, I was like, because sexual agency becomes not about sexual agency so much as about them trying to exercise agency in realms where they don't have any, right? It just immediately goes back to the stereotype of women as duplicitous and of women as, the fake orgasm thing, right? And I thought, my gosh, you just, your framework is the perfect answer to that. It's like, duh. In a world where you've created this kind of lack of the dignity of risk and the lack of material resources, and that's it. Of course, what else do you expect, right? These kinds of duplicitous triangulating, right, narratives or triangulating resources, self-generated resources is all they're left with, right? I mean, does that speak to?
Absolutely. You know, so yes, I mean, this idea like that femininity is always about negotiating, manipulating, right? Indirectly, trying everything we can to access the things that we are denied direct access to through influencing others. And, you know, it's interesting, I gave a talk earlier this week that was a little bit related, but not exactly. And I had to go back to this talk that I gave, like this research project that I did when I was a grad student, actually. And it was about a feminist empowerment program that was like, you know, that would make all the feminists cringe at some of the things that this program entailed. And, you know, really well-intentioned, but oof, wow, really misguided. But one of the girls in the program, they were doing a lesson about sexual harassment. And this was to middle school girls. And they said, well, what would you do if you were at a pool and a boy came up and touched your breast? And that was it. It wasn't like he grabbed you, he hurt you, a scary guy came up, right? It was just a boy came up and touched your breast. And this one girl in the group was like, I wouldn't mind if it's a guy I like, right? You know, and everyone was up in arms about, you know, how, what a terrible sign this was of how she lacked sort of self-esteem and self-worth, that she wouldn't object to a boy touching her breast. And, you know, but to me, right, that was like a perfect example of what agency can look like when you are not allowed to show it, right? You just have to like position yourself and hope that the right boy comes and touches your breast, right? That's like how immobilizing. But then of course you're damned, you know, if the wrong boy comes and you say, yeah, no, I didn't want him to touch my breast. They're like, well, but then why were you wearing that? Why were you sitting there? Why were you doing all these things, right? So, and then Corinne, your point, I just want to say what agency looks like, the open-ended responses to what would a woman like with a lot of agency and like lots of control in her sexual life look like. I didn't read all of the quotes. They are so depressing because they are all like neo versions of gatekeeping. It's just all about setting boundaries, setting boundaries, setting boundaries, and responding to male overtures. And how good are you at that? It has not, there's no movement at all.
Can I still ask a question as a follow-up though?
But there's a lot of people waiting to ask questions.
Sorry.
Do you mind?
Sorry.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll come back, Corinne. We'll come back. So save the question.
Yeah.
Okay. Maria Amir, you've been waiting a while. Please ask your question.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me. Thank you so much for this. I'm sort of, when you mentioned initially the virgin slut binary, I immediately thought of the way sexuality and sexual agency is framed in the Muslim world, because that's literally the binary that exists, that, you know, there's the Muslim world is entirely framed under sort of a virgin binary, and the Western world is framed under the other. And so something that I was thinking about throughout your talk was, how does the fact that these are usually the two poles that exist in this framing, how does one narrative correct but in practical terms that align with Nussbaum's capabilities approach? Is there a way to sort of also incorporate a sort of broader narrative of talking about sexuality?
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm like hearing two different questions and I don't know if I'm going to respond to the right one. So maybe somebody else actually hears the question better than I do. Because, so I thought I was going to respond, but then you mentioned the Nussbaum and I'm like, oh, I don't know actually what she would think about these things. I do think there is a lot of positioning. Girls are jockeying all the time. And this is a lot of what made me actually think like this virgin slut thing is not enough anymore. And you hear actually a lot of sort of women who, young women who choose to be abstinent, including for religious reasons, right? From whether and whatever faith, right? Instead of people saying that it's about obedience, right? You hear young women talking about this and framing it in terms of choice, right? And in terms of a thing that they knowingly want and choose, and that this is what keeps them from being seen as some sort of tool, right? Because this is like, you're not ever allowed to be a tool of anybody anymore, right? That would be, you know, sort of means that you're not human, is to say that your agency is at all constrained. And so you, like, women will frame their choices around abstinence, well, their abstinence as a choice, as a freely made one that means so much to them personally. And so I think like that's how you see women trying to, and to jockey and to position themselves in relation to, and to make sure that people understand that they're either their abstinence or their activity, that this is not that I'm just an obedient, mindless girl, and I'm also not just an out of control slut. I am in control. This is me calling the shots. But I think that there's a lot of interesting sort of, there are a lot of scripts now for that.
Very good. Anyone else would like to pose a question to Dr.
Tia had a
Bay-Cheng?
question. Tia Palermo.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Hi, thank you for a really great talk. I have a two-part question. So my first question is, in the interviews that you've done, have you done any since the outbreak of the pandemic, looking at how COVID-19 is exacerbating some of these driving factors or environments? And then just thinking about these topics that you raised about kind of the conflict between parents versus adolescents' rights. I mean, we know adolescents can consent to things like contraceptive use and abortion without parental rights, but what about competing interests in terms of like long-term effects? So this might be a little too off topic, but I'm just thinking about, for example, like the HPV vaccine. You know, that's something that's optional, it's very expensive, but you know, your parental preferences while your child is young and when that vaccine can be most effective is actually when the parent has more control, even though the outcomes can last for a lifetime for the girl. So again, I don't know if it's too off topic to answer here, but I'm just kind of interested in that trade-off.
Yeah, so just to your first question, so our interviews with the service providers were all from before, just from last fall, actually. I do know from the community sort of coalitions and partners, and actually there's somebody on here from Planned Parenthood, and she maybe, I'm not going to put her on the spot too much, but she maybe will comment. But I do think that there are, for sure, I mean, we know that that there are tremendous risks, and there's no escape from the risks that many young women experience in their homes, right? So all kinds of sort of circumstances of violence and degradation. But also one of the things that we heard in early conversations about how young women were experiencing COVID was actually how they are now charged with extra childcare. And this is a thing, like people are like, oh, what's happening in their sexual lives? But actually, like a lot of young women were saying that they weren't able to go to school, or they're not able to do a bunch of things because they are now the ones who have to take care of their younger siblings and cousins, right? So like girls are caretaking a lot now. So I think that that's a thing that we don't sort of think enough about. And what I heard also, I will say, just again, just kind of anecdotally from colleagues at Planned Parenthood, was that they were doing a lot of telehealth and seeing a lot of girls, and that actually, you know, was, was going pretty well, and that girls felt like they had access. The parental rights issue is for sure a complicated one, and I don't pretend that and I don't pretend otherwise, but I do think it is a problem worth sorting out. and that there must be a way for young people to have real input into how their bodies are treated all the time. And in fact, I think that parents showing that and showing that they also will defer to what a young person wants to be done to their body and how they want their bodies to be treated is an important way of modeling for a young person how they should expect everyone will treat their bodies. So the details of how that should be negotiated, I don't know. I do think that age alone is a really inadequate way to decide when somebody should get to have a right and not. And that we need a scaffolded approach in which, and we also maybe need a reframing away from parents' rights to parental responsibilities as stewards of resources, not as proprietors or owners of children. Underlying the parents' rights, I hear a lot of owners' rights. And I think that is very different than being like, a keeper or a caretaker of someone while in the ways that they need it and only when they need it. So I think a reframing and movement away from parental rights as though it's a given would be helpful.
Thank you, Laina. Other questions, observations? Corinne, do you want to ask your follow-up?
I'm sorry, I'm just too excited by this talk. Okay, there were two parts to my talk, and I'm trying to remember. Oh yeah, first, so agree about the adultism, and I'm just to give you an example from my own life. So I sent my daughter a lot of memes and things, and I sent her this one, which was from Facebook. Teach your daughters less about fitting into glass slippers. Not that she wears glass slippers, but it's a metaphor. And more about shattering the glass ceilings, right? And then she wrote me, she didn't miss a beat. She was like, I don't have to choose, Mom. And it was such a, she totally she blew my mind too. But my question for you is this. I was really interested by how the framing of the talk in terms of femininity, and it could have been because you ended there, which was racial discrimination. And so was that strategic? Is that a choice that you made? Is that just a reflection of how you got to that result, or a strategic kind of framing of the argument? I just was trying to figure out.
So, a lot of my work does look at, this idea of who gets to be an agent, right, has nothing to do, just like, are you a virgin or are you a slut, right? It's not connected to real behavior, right, or experience, right? It's about how you are seen and what you are allowed to be. And the same is true of agency, right? It is a thoroughly racialized thing. In fact, there have been studies, there was a study, Paying for the Party. It's a book written by Elizabeth Armstrong and her colleagues that looks at how white women with privilege, or socioeconomic privilege, talk about getting around being called a slut precisely because they are wealthy and pretty and have tons of capital, right? And they know how to act the part. It is all thoroughly racialized. It's not, and the reason why, like my Miley Cyrus things, right? She's allowed to be seen as an agent, and she's also was at one time seen as a virgin, right? Racialized girls, they are not ever seen as either of those, right? You are not an agent. You can't be, right? That we have like a whole set of, and a whole history of racialized misogyny that prevents women of color, particularly Black women and also Latinas, from being seen as agentic, and similarly as being seen as pure and virtuous, right? Virtue and agency are not things that are allowed. And so no, I mean, in that sense, there is absolutely a racialized discourse. And the lessons, I have a whole other thing that we could get into about choice and the way that choice is talked about and to which girls, and the ways in which girls of color are talked to about how to make proud choices, as though, again, what they lack is pride. Anyway, and it's, but again, while keeping the conditions of their lives, not just the same, but unquestioned. That the only source of change will be when they decide what they are worth. Anyway.
Very good. Very good. Other comments? Arabella, did you have your hand up? I wasn't able to. Okay, sure.
I did have my hand up, and the canary will sing, I'm sure, as I'm doing this. So I've been thinking through this and not quite able to articulate this as nuancedly as I want to, which usually causes a problem anyway. But I recently read a study, like in the last few years, that discussed hookup culture as a form of girls' agency to avoid the confinements of relationships. And I had a hard time getting my head around this, mother of young women. But I did. But I keep coming back to the problem of young women having enough information, women in general having enough information, that is, the capabilities not here, to make decisions about their lives. You know, and given the health problems of multiple partners, I keep thinking about the limited choices women are still offered. So that, when I was in Singapore, because I did not have a maid, I spent a lot of time with Filipino maids, and they talked about their very limited choices. And I think, and then you have to wonder, is it real, if you have such limited choices, does it really border on trafficking? Do girls have such limited choices that hookup culture becomes their only escape from patriarchal relationships?
Yeah. So, you know, I actually, I did a study on this, and this is actually one of the studies that I did, and that's started a lot of my thinking about, like, how is neoliberal ideology being taken up and used by young women, in part to protect against, and Corinne, like, I credit you in all of my work for this, right? But to protect against the slur of being called a victim, right? I mean, so all of this is very much about warding off victim status, right? That is, you know, the lowest of the low. It is like a subhuman status. Not really, like, I don't think that, right? Okay, so, but anyway, so I was doing this study on unwanted sex, and also about like, what kinds of sexual behaviors are women engaging in with different kinds of partners, and how do they feel about those? And one of the things that was most interesting, and we were doing this right around the same time as a lot of the stuff about hookup culture, and Friends with Benefits was sort of hitting the mainstream. One of the things that we found out from, and this was a qualitative and a quantitative study, but quantitatively, the women talked about being most likely to consent to unwanted sex and to have not awesome sex with their boyfriends. So one-time hookups and serious relationships were sort of like equally problematic. Friends with benefits relationships were that we did not hear once of an unwanted sexual experience, of a time that you consented even though you kind of weren't in the mood. And the pleasure ratings were the highest of any relationship type. And what we thought was that, right, because there is no script telling you that a good girlfriend wouldn't, like, you know, a good girlfriend would, you know, make him happy because he came all this way to see you, and a good girlfriend would be X, Y, and Z. And so, you know, the hookup culture thing, I think, first of all, people collapse like single one-time experiences with not romantic ones. And I think those are very different. And it's important to recognize that. And to also to recognize that like heterosexual, like, and not just heterosexual, right? Because like, I think we can talk about homonormativity too, but this script of the script of two-person intimacy doesn't work very well for women a lot. And that young women are looking for an out of that, I don't see as a bad thing. And that young women are like not apologizing for looking for that, I don't see as a bad thing. That it doesn't always work out is certainly true, but that's true of relationships also. And so I think that the response always needs to be, so what are we doing to minimize to the greatest extent possible the risks and the costs of a mistake? And that's the only thing that we can do. I think we don't get to tell people how to live, but that it is our obligation to make sure that no one is disproportionately, avoidably exposed to risk or to cost that others of us are spared from. And that's what enabling capabilities really means. It means that no matter what your choice, you will have access to the same supports that anyone else does. We don't just give it when we approve of some people's behavior, but deny it if we don't approve of your behavior. You know, and the issue around agency and choice, and, you know, the young women that I sort of referred to, for sure. I mean, their experiences, you know, but they wouldn't show up. And this is part of my frustration with a lot of the discussions around consent, is that people think consent is enough. I'm like, consent, that is a low bar. You know, just you might consent to a lot of things that are still like fundamentally violating your rights. But I don't think that the response can be to tell those women that they made the wrong choices, or that they did something wrong, or that they made a weak choice, or that they, you know, their calculations were spot on. You know, Stephanie did not have another choice. I am quite sure of that, because she didn't see it. And just telling her she was seeing something wrong was not, I think is an inappropriate response. It's not an ethically driven one.
Very good.
Thank you for that. That was good. Thank you.
Yeah, very helpful. Other questions, insights?
I have kind of a pragmatic question, if you don't mind, Carrie.
Sure.
So like, I think about like kind of the go-to is go give Aunt Hillary a hug when I come home, right? And I'm just like, nope, you don't have to do that. Would you like to high five and stuff? But like, people get irritated with me when I like pause, like, I don't expect a hug. I'd like a hug if you want to, but we can do a high five or whatever. So like on a pragmatic level, and thinking about adultism, how can we like interact with adolescents or children in our orbits that minimizes that adultism dynamic?
I mean, I really don't think that, so I think, like, on the one hand, it's going to seem like I'm being overly simplistic, but that's in part because I don't think it has to be very complicated, right? I mean, it is not unlike any time we interact with anybody who's different from us, right? You know, we do this all the time. I don't think that age alters one's humanity, you know, and in the same way that we should treat, you know, people who look differently from us and people who have different abilities from us. Like, you know, I've been saying, like, I think that at the core of adultism, right, is ableism, and this idea that people who cannot do the way we think someone ought to do and to think, that means that they somehow should be treated differently from us. And I think that that's a really problematic and clearly it's a really dangerous, terrible path to go down. Anyway, so I think that, you know, like, yeah, when, you know, people who are younger than us, we should be treating them in the same way. And just like if I meet a stranger, I'm thinking, how how will they understand my intention? How will they understand what I am trying to communicate to them? Like, we're all the time adjusting ourselves and our presentation to match and to be intelligible to the person we're interacting with. Like, that's what makes us successful creatures, is that humans are good at this. But why we would turn that off when we interact with somebody who's a different age from us, but we hopefully don't turn it off when we interact with someone with different eye color, right? Or a different accent, right? It doesn't make sense to me. So again, it's this treatment of age or the treatment of sex as though somehow special rules apply that I think gets us into problems. These are ordinary issues that we engage and we conquer all the time in our lives. They become a problem when we treat certain domains or certain people as extraordinary, and we act like we don't know what to do.
Thank you, Laina. Melinda Lemke has a question and a comment.
Laina, thank you so much for your presentation. It was just so insightful.
I can barely hear you, just so you know.
Oh no. Can you hear me now?
It's a bit stronger. Can you check your volume, Melinda, real quick on the laptop or the keyboard?
It says it's 100% up.
Okay, well, we'll listen carefully.
Okay, I'll try. So I wanted to say thank you so much for your
Yeah, that's good.
presentation. It was wonderful, so insightful, so many things to be thinking about and crossovers with some of the work I've been doing. And so you talked about policy. And of course, I'm very interested and focused on educational policy and processes, right, within schools and how they're implemented. And we know that adultism and neoliberal ideology as it relates to normative values are riddled throughout our policies related to various populations, whether we're talking about women and rape culture, we're talking about immigration, or we're talking about trafficking, right? It's there. But I'm also interested in how policy actors, right, at the local level are charged with implementing these already very problematic policies, right, through programs, through curriculum, et cetera, et cetera. And so, what I've seen both as a practitioner and then also in my own research is this level of adultism also happening within schools, because of and loco parentis and this charge that adults have with, taking care of, right, youth. And so, and these normative values there are being repeated over and over again in terms of how adults, teachers, principals, leaders think about our youth. And I've seen this from, everything from in my own classes with, aspiring principals and superintendents where, in trying to talk at a baseline level about sexual violence, I will see the politics of niceness come out from women where they don't want to talk about it, or they talk about it in very guarded ways, to men in my classes saying, I don't really see the relevance about talking about sexual violence or child abuse. And I'm thinking, you should be fired. Okay. But anyway, let's set that aside. So I'm wondering how, so on one level, you have these very problematic policies riddled with normative values, but you also have policy actors who are charged with their implementation and their level of knowledge and their experiences across this vast continuum. What would you recommend, or what are you seeing in your conversations with community partners, how we begin to address the knowledge gaps that our educators have, the will, the capacity to have these conversations? Some clearly are. They recognize issues related to agency and empowerment and sexual violence are real concerns, particularly now, and want to have these conversations, but their hands could be tied. I'm just wondering what you would recommend for entering that conversation as you're talking to school leaders or what you're doing in the field.
Yeah, so I think this is actually a super important issue. I had a very, very short stint as a practicing social worker, right? I had a very short stint, like living not in a school, outside academia. And it drives me a little bit crazy, and I know this is not what you're doing, but I think it is very easy to throw service providers under the bus. And I hear it all the time, including I hear it from, we just submitted a paper actually based on these sort of policy obstructions. And a reviewer was like, well, but how come you don't take providers to task, more or less, this is what they were saying, how come you don't take them to task for, all of their, whatever, their like imposition of norms, and why do you trust what providers are saying? And I'm just like, these are people who are doing work that so many other people turn away from, and people who are working with communities that many of us just wash our hands of. And it outrages me that there are so many academics in particular who will talk in like this lofty rhetoric about respecting, the complexity of young people's lives or whatever person's life, but then turn around and dismiss the complexity of the labor conditions of the providers who work with them, and say, oh, as though they are like just simpletons or, anyway. And so that, first of all, just makes me crazy. I do think that like work conditions, people like the volume of work, the precarity of work, the gross underpayment, and also then the lack of training, the lack of space to be able to sit and just think, and to think about like, okay, what are my principles? What are my values? What do we know to be true? And then how am I going to arrange my practice in the next, day, right? Like those things take time, and they take space. And the reason why academics, many of us, are able to think these things is because this is what we get paid to do. We are protected in so many ways to be able to think these things. And so I think that, not only do our policies need revision, but the work environments of practitioners need to be completely overhauled, so that they too have opportunity to think and to plan, and then to be able to practice with that in mind. Yeah, and so I think that's actually a first step, is to create capacity in the lives of providers to be able to do the work that they first of all have signed up to do, which I think is no small thing. And then to make sure that they have access to the information and the opportunities to be able to figure out how to practice this. And also to be able to see that, so what we heard a lot from providers was how nervous they were about getting in trouble. And this is especially around reporting. People are nervous about a parent finding out that you brought their daughter to Planned Parenthood. Even though it's their legal right, providers are worried, rightfully, that they're going to get fired, that they're going to get sued, that bad things are going to happen. And they're not, wrong. Anyway, so I think we need to address those conditions. And then I think we will see providers working with more confidence, including taking the risks that, that are entailed in saying, like, what, your daughter is entitled to this, actually. You may disagree, but this is her right. And then being able to align ourselves with those. But that takes a lot of, privilege, actually. I mean, it shouldn't be privilege, but it is in our world.
Very good. I think we have time for one more question. We also have a fascinating chat going on about the hijab and the sexual politics of that in terms of agency.
Yeah, and I was going to put in the chat, I really want to recommend a colleague of mine in the Netherlands. I'll put her name in the chat, Marianne Sens. And she wrote right around the same time that I was writing this 2019 paper, like about sort of thinking about agency differently. She wrote a paper that also takes up agency, and she talks a lot about bonded agency, and specifically thinks about Oh, because she's in the Netherlands, and so she thinks a lot about how ethnic minorities in the Netherlands express and exercise agency in ways that are not always correctly seen and understood as such. Anyway, so.
Very good. Any other comments or alternative? Okay, go ahead, Maria.
When you talked about racial minorities and how race is such a huge component of who is seen or not, I just wanted to sort of ask with regards to that, because I'm sorry, I'm coming off of so much of this from the election coverage recently and how race was talked about. And I remember there was so much commentary on how people were shocked that so many Black people also voted for Trump, for example, or there was a lot of commentary on that. And I remember commenting how it was so surprising to people that people of color can also be racist, or that people of color can be classist, because it's sort of this idea that that sort of individuality is associated so much with whiteness, and racial minorities aren't uniquely individual. And so I wondered if that plays into the same kind of flattening of how racial minority women are sort of sexualized. Is it also on that same level of they're not really individuals, therefore they can all be lumped together and sexualized in one group?
Well, I think, right, this is the state of being, and it is the mechanism of sort of dehumanization, right? So when people talk about racism and misogyny, right, or oppression, I'm like, right, dehumanization, right? Because this is what stereotypes do, they dehumanize. And so it's funny, I had the exact same, well, it wasn't a like sort of conversation with somebody when people were like, well, yeah, what do you know? People have their own minds, and people do all kinds of crazy things with their own minds. And why is that a liberty or a thing that we would extend only to some people, but, you know, it boggles us that, you know, not everyone, you know, like received the same brain, you know, in some other group of people. But to me, so right, this is what speaks to dehumanization as the thing that underlies all of these mechanisms of oppression, yes, and these vectors and stereotypes, right? So and stereotyping is interesting because it both denies the humanity and the mind of the person being stereotyped, while it also like gives the person doing the stereotyping, it allows us to shut our mind off. Right, so we don't attend to the idea that we're speaking to an individual, and everything and the complexity that could come with that. Right, you know, this is why we do it. It's this cognitive, you know, shortcut, and it's like a labor saver cognitively. But no, I mean, I see, right, dehumanization is at the core of all of these things. And this is what it is to be dehumanized, is that nothing you do is seen as a function of your humanity and your individuality, and the different weird ways that you may want to live your life, or the weird things that you enjoy, or you're scared, right? All of those things, they're flattened, right? And you are just what other people have decided, how they have decided to see you, and everything is filtered only through those. And so if you vote for Trump, it must be because you are self-hating, right? Or if you vote, right? And so, yeah, I mean, this is what all of these, and I don't think that race and misogyny, like I think we all realize that you cannot even talk about anything without talking about those, whether you're saying it or not. None of these exist separately from each other or from what we think of as, you know, the real world.
Okay, thank you. Laina, you have done a magnificent job today, both in your talk and generating such an outstanding discussion. And thank you all who participated and listened and engaged in it. It was just been invaluable to me. And we will be sharing the chat with all of you, as well as a link to the recording. And I hope these conversations can carry on. Just outstanding. So thank you so much, Laina, for your time and
you,
for all of you
everybody.
for coming today.
Take care, everyone.